what I would like to do now is I'd like to invite our panellists up to the stage, and also whilst they are coming up here, the panellists that I would like to invite is our chair, Dr. Erika Pearson, Senior Lecturer in Communication and or PR, Massey University. Our panellists, Kashmir Hill, John Edwards, and also Allan Sylvester, the Deputy Head of School of Information Management from the Victoria University. So thank you. Everyone, if you can get yourselves all comfortable. I also want to take a moment, part and parcel of our Māori identity, as you heard this morning in the pōheri, is to acknowledge those that have passed. And I've just been informed that a relation of mine, Te Papa has recently passed away. He was a long-term standing minister for New Zealand First, and also a huge advocate for Ngāpuhi and Ngāti Hine. So Te Papa, e moi, e moi. All right, so now we're going to move into our panel discussion, cyber trust and digital engagement. The floor is yours, Erika. Rock and roll and enjoy yourselves.
Thank you very much. Kia ora koutou. What we're hoping to do today, instead of talking at you, is having more of a conversation. Thank you for that. You can tell when the microphone kicks in. So what we're hoping to do today is have a conversation across our diverse areas of interest. So just to recap, we have Kashmir Hill, who I hope you all heard this morning, tech reporter from the New York Times. We have John Edwards, who you definitely just heard about, who is the New Zealand Privacy Commissioner. People you haven't heard from yet is Allan Sylvester, who is the Deputy Head of School for the School of Information Management at Victoria, and Kim Connolly-Stone, who is a Policy Director at Internet New Zealand. So across our panel, we have quite a wide and diverse range of interests. So I'm going to be firing some questions at our panel, and hopefully they'll have interesting responses. But I also encourage you to engage through Slido, and I have Slido running on my little tablet here. I reserve the right to synthesize some questions, so if you feel I haven't answered your question properly, please ask it again. But I'm going to start the panel off with a question of my own, and I'm going to ask you, what do you think is the biggest factor shaping how we trust in our digital spaces? So, Allan, do you want to raise some issues? I'll twist it that way.
Around trust in our digital spaces. Trust for me is dependent on who I'm working with, and my focus of a lot of my energies is around vulnerable communities, and the sort of trust framework that I would be putting in place for a group of marginalised community is quite different from that say Kashmir would be experiencing in her experiment or something like that. So I think I'm going to fall back to, and it depends a little bit on that one.
Contextual. Can you know?
Thanks, Sarah, and kia ora, everyone out there. I was going to say there's this bright light in my face, if I'm squinting at you. It's not because I'm screwing up my face. For me, I think the biggest issue I want to highlight today is the connection between digital identity and digital inclusion. At Internet New Zealand, we're all about an open and secure internet that's for all New Zealanders, and it's that for all New Zealanders part that I really want to focus on. We really need to ensure all New Zealanders are digitally included, and it was great to have Minister Whāwhoi here this morning talking about plans for digital inclusion. You know, it's that access, it's skills, it's motivation and trust to use the internet. And what we happen to know is that the last time the OECD did a survey of how digitally skilled adults were in New Zealand, 45% only had very basic internet skills. So I think what this means is for technologists, when they're designing digital identity solutions and products, they really have to take into account the New Zealanders that are digitally excluded, who don't have that trust and don't have those skills. So it's a big push, I think, to the technologists there. I mean, sure, at the same time, there's a lot of organisations out there in the community doing their best to help build digital inclusion and build those skills and build those trusts. But if the technologists who are building these things aren't thinking about the fact that people can be the weakest link, we're going to have a bit of an issue on our hands. So for me, that's the biggest issue. Thank you.
I'll let John and Kashmir before I jump in and build on that.
Sure, thanks. I I mean, trust has to be deliberately worked on and focused on. I mean, our most successful online enterprise is built on a foundation of trust. TradeMe provides these connections between people and provides trust signatures so that, you know, when I have an interaction with Kashmir and I say that went well, we are building that sort of trust capital. But the other thing, in terms of government, that I think is really essential is transparency and openness. What will happen to this information? What is the nature of this transaction? How did we get to this point? How have we built this system? You know, show us the privacy impact assessments, for example. RealMe, for example, is a really well-designed mechanism intended to foster trust, and it does that by minimising the data that it collects about people's transactions online. So I would say that it's something that we need to work on, that we need to demonstrate, and that you need to be prepared to be very open and transparent in order to build that trust as a platform provider.
It's such a complicated question, this idea of trust in digital spaces. I mean, when I think about trust, I usually think about the platforms themselves and the degree to which we trust them. And I think we're in an environment right now where people don't trust the platforms, where people don't trust their social network to responsibly handle their data. And what's hard about that, I mean, what I struggle a lot with writing about privacy is that people will say, privacy is dead. You know, I don't think it's possible to have privacy. And they claim that they've given up and they just don't trust these platforms. And yet they still use them and they still do expect their privacy, which they realize when something terrible happens. So yeah, I think trust is very hard. I think about it in, especially in the context of Facebook, that there's a lot of people who feel that they don't trust Facebook right now, but they still do have to use the platform. As I talked about in my talk, it's something that we're very dependent on in society, and yet Facebook is doing so much to collect information about the people that use it. So a couple of years ago, I was writing a lot about Facebook's People You May Know feature, which introduces you to people that you probably know in the real world that you might want to connect with on Facebook. And I was writing about it because people were so disturbed by some of the recommendations. It showed that Facebook knew their real world network too well. And there were real harms that came from this. There were vulnerable communities that were affected, and I wrote about sex workers. Sex workers, despite the fact that they were using, you know, a burner email address, a burner phone number, a different name, Facebook was still collecting so much information about them and about their clients that it was connecting them through People You May Know and outing their real names to their clients and vice versa. So yeah, I think trust is something that we're really struggling with today, just given our kind of inability to control what information is collected about us and how it's used.
Just picking up on that, and there's a couple of questions that have popped up on the Slido. How do we balance that idea that John was talking about the identity and the self and those issues there, with the profit-based motive of a lot of these companies? For them, it's financially very expedient to get as much information about us as they can, to repackage it in different ways, to make these connections, to get, as you said in your talk, you know, you're still on Facebook because that's where your friends are. So it makes sense for them to want to pull not just your identity, but your entire network's identity together. So a question for the panel in general, but perhaps I'll start with you, Kashmir. How do you think we can reconcile these questions of identity with a very capitalistic, financially driven... That's a nice, simple question to welcome you to New Zealand.
I mean, I think it's really difficult. There is... I think that they're in conflict, and we're starting to see a little bit of some businesses are trying to build, privacy and kind of more of a social ethos into their businesses, but they are small companies that have a very small percentage of the market at this point. and that the only way we've kind of effectively seen change is when governments do get involved, or when people file lawsuits, or when local privacy commissioners go after these companies and investigate them. And so I think it really, for so long in the U.S., there just wasn't strong privacy law. I mean, we don't have a privacy commissioner in the United States, and so much of the policing of the platforms has come through other countries. The European privacy commissioners who discovered, for example, that Google's Street View cars were sucking up information from people's unsecured Wi-Fi networks, including their passwords and all kinds of sensitive data. This was something that was discovered because the Privacy Commission basically went and looked at their files to see what they were collecting. So I think in order for us to feel trust, these platforms really do need to be policed by the government and then through the legal system, through lawsuits.
That actually I want to tie these together in interesting ways, and that raises an interesting question. You say that individuals should try and reclaim that power in some way. We've had this discussion before. But Allan and Kim, perhaps you want to talk a bit about how the underprivileged enter into that conversation, because if you don't feel you have the confidence to speak back to Facebook, for example, or if you need access to get a job, for example, how then does that renegotiate your relationship to these big commercial platforms?
Yeah. Thanks, Erika. I don't think it's necessarily just about the underprivileged or the disenfranchised, but also the rest of us get an opportunity. I think John touched on it in his talk, where if we're sending email, the protocol is open. So it's okay to change platform. We can shift from Gmail, we can go to another provider very easily. With Facebook, they made it easy to join the walled garden and difficult to get out of it. But over time, we may see that change, and we've already got commentators like Tim Berners-Lee in the linked data movement saying, actually, it's your data. Keep it to yourself. Keep it local, and share it with whomever you need to share it with. So it might be that these big platforms will come under pressure in time, and that we might be going through this phase, and sooner rather than later we might be saying, remember Facebook? Yeah.
I guess I'd add to that an awareness raising call, and it's not just for anybody using these products and services. So many of us don't know what we're getting into, and I'm not on Facebook, and I never bought into it. I cheat sometimes. I look at my husband's account to see what Middens the cat is doing around Wellington. That's probably when I fall off the wagon. But it's not just, the awareness raising doesn't just sit with those folks who are trying to build the skills of folks who really struggle with this. As I mentioned before, it's with the technologists, it's with the folks building these new products. And so I imagine if there were more businesses out there saying, we'd like an alternative, we don't want to be so dependent on AWS, for example, maybe they would start to have some alternatives offered to them, that they could be, a company that says, this is the credentials I'm offering, this is how I'm going to respect your privacy and your dignity, and hopefully they would have a little more credibility around that. That would be a little utopian dream of mine.
It's interesting that you say that, and I want to pick up on something that John mentioned in his talk, is that these platforms are often black boxes. Forgiving all the Linux people in the room, but most of the main platforms that most people use are black boxes. Do you think that's had an overwhelming or an underwhelming, or changed the nature perhaps of the way we're talking about identity and being in these spaces? The fact that we don't actually know, we put our identity in and something comes out and it might say, you want to buy this. Do you think the idea that these are closed systems has changed the way we've talked about this discussion?
Yeah. Sure, I think it has. And I think there's that creep factor as well. That creates anxiety. It's the opposite of well-being. There are a lot of people out there who believe that Facebook is listening to their audio and putting advertisements in their feed based on things that they're talking about. Now, this is one occasion where I believe the denials of that. I don't think that's happening. But when you feel surveilled, when you feel constantly observed and picked apart and harvested, that does create unease. The case that Kashmir mentioned of the sex workers having, basically being doxed and connected to their clients, and their clients being connected. I think you also wrote about a psychiatrist whose patients are starting to get friend recommendations to each other, even though their only point of contact was this, extremely confidential relationship that they would not wish to share with anybody else. So I do think that sense of anxiety is increased when we don't know what comes next, and there's no effort on those platforms to open up the black box, to explain, to build trust. There's just a constant chipping away at it. But they still like crack to us. We have to come back to them. And that's not to say, when I use the addiction analogy, that's not to say that it's a flaw in us. It's designed this way so that we can't pull away. It is a monopoly. All the features that Kashmir showed us in her talk bind us to these platforms. We are not equal economic actors. We are not able to exercise our free, rational market choice. It's been taken from us. And, part of that is the secrecy of the algorithm, the black box, how it works. And I do think that whether you go an antitrust route and bust these companies up, or a transparency route and just demand that they explain, who do you think I am? I don't know what the answer is, but I agree with you that is a significant part of the problem.
Yeah, I've seen this creeping in my teaching. I get 700 new friends every trimester in my 100 level course, and I do a little poll of asking who is a customer of Facebook, and a large number of hands traditionally go up, and then we talk about it a little more, and it sort of emerges that they're not really the customer, they're the product. Yeah. And that leads us on to talk about the data sovereignty aspect, and what is it that we need, what questions do we need to be asking about? What is our data at a national level, and data governance as it chunks down, and what does things like algorithmic transparency need to look like in this world if we're going to be using these platforms in every aspect of our lives, and then we need to actually be able to control that power duty conversation with those platform providers, and get to say these are the outcomes that we expect if we engage with you on these, and maybe the nexus of control. They make their money. If we follow the money, they make their money from their advertisers, and we have the ability to affect their advertisers by having very public conversations about it.
One thing I wonder about, to the Commissioner's point about more transparency to understand why we see what we see, is that I think the companies have started to try to do this. You can go to Facebook and you can download your file. You can go to Google and you can download your file. And, this is illuminating to a certain extent. I think something that really surprised people when they downloaded their Google file recently, it surprised me, is that it had, is that they had been tracking every flight that I took, going back to when I first started using Google's in 2004, 2005. They were basically just mining that information out of my emails, where the airline tells you about your flight, and that they had been capturing this information. But then, so you get to see something like that, but you don't kind of get a sense of how it's actually being used. Same thing with Facebook. You can find out, every advertiser who has uploaded your email address. And when I did this, it was basically a lot of car companies, and then politicians, and just, companies I never remember interacting with. But how do we get to a place where that data is meaningful, or we kind of understand how judgments were made about us based on data? And I think at this point, we haven't really been able to achieve that. And I don't know if we ever can, if transparency is enough, because it seems hard for these companies to even look at the decisions they make about us and to understand why we saw an ad that we saw. I just don't know if they keep track of this information enough to shed light. I guess that's just it's more of a question of what's kind of technologically possible.
I'm going to move this, sorry. I think that actually leads to another question that's on the Slido here, and I'm going to paraphrase it slightly. But how do you think the fact that these large companies have this data that they're manipulating in black boxes to produce mainly advertising for us, and then alongside we also have things like public services and governments who also have to use this, and so this kind of links back to Allan's point about data sovereignty. What kinds of responsibilities do you think we as a nation state might have to have our own citizens' data held locally, for example, rather than, say, an Amazon Web Service, as you found in your experiment? Allan, do you have any thoughts? Or Kim? John?
Well, I'll take that. I mean, I think that there are questions of scale which mean that it's not in New Zealand's interest to limit data to our shores. The economies of some of the AWS, Microsoft Azure, and other kind of commodity cloud service providers are such that it would be an enormous tax on the economy to deny New Zealand business and government the opportunity to use those. What is important, though, is wherever you store data, that you ensure you retain control over it and that you retain sight of what's happening to it. And you do that by contractual and technological means as much as you can.
I actually agree. It's an area that we can't be isolationist about it, but I think that the nature of those controls is quite a challenge. It's how do we actually engage in those conversations and make them public conversations as well, get transparency about what's going where and why, and just keep that conversation rolling. I don't think it's a point-in-time conversation. I think we need to just keep revisiting it on a regular basis. Yeah.
But actually, I want to connect this back to some other questions that have been appearing online and also in all of your various comments. You mentioned you have 700 new friends. I also have many, many hundreds of new friends every year, and I ask the same question. And the response they give me, even once we talk about data sovereignty, these are 17 and 18-year-olds, and they say, "What does it matter? My parents have been putting up photos since I was on ultrasound." And so there's probably two arguments going alongside here. There's the one argument that we should be controlling data sovereignty and we should be supporting minority communities and we should be training people. On the other hand, there's too late, eggs are out of the basket and shattered all over the floor. So perhaps my question might be, should we care that the horse is bolted with the cart? If the 17 and 18-year-olds are feeling that their entire lives are already consumed within these systems that you've spoken about. Does anybody want a nice, simple question?
I have many feelings on this. Well, one, I think that people they misportray teenagers as not caring about privacy. I just absolutely don't agree with that at all, and see teenagers doing many things to try to maintain their privacy. It's very common for teenagers to have multiple online identities. For example, they'll have the real world one that they're preparing basically for college applications, and then they have the other one that all their friends their parents, and then they have the other one that's their real account with a fake name or a different version of their name that they share with their friends. And so I do think that teenagers are trying very hard to control what information is available about them, but it's hard. And I think what's so hard for young people and for all of us is that you just put information out there, whether privately or publicly, without knowing how it will come back to harm you later. And it's so hard to predict that. And so we're seeing a lot with, I think people, young people who grew up with the internet, who are now in their first jobs or second jobs, who are, it's happening in journalism a lot right now. because of the political strife in the United States, and kind of journalists being portrayed as the enemy of the state, that conservative groups right now are going back through journalists' social media and basically finding stupid things that they said when they were teenagers or in college. I mean, horrible things they shouldn't have said, racial slurs, anti-Semitic comments, and they're digging those up now. And these are just the kind of decisions that you make when you're a teenager or in your early 20s are not often very wise. And we've created this environment now where this is kind of archived forever. And so, part of what I wish is that these companies would think more about that and build protections into the products. So, for example, Twitter should have a self-expiration option. So you can say, okay, I want this tweet to live for a month or a week or a year, and then I would like it to disappear, but they don't offer that option. And so you would theoretically either have to go back and delete, years of your tweets, or use a third party that logs in, which is not a very secure thing to do, to hand over, your private Twitter username and password to this third party to do deletion for you. But I wish that these companies would think more about how to protect young people who do care about their privacy, and really all of us, because it's not just something that young people are struggling with.
Yeah, I wonder if we should be trying to stimulate discussions amongst our young people about things like the right to be forgotten, which is gaining quite a lot of traction in Europe, but it doesn't seem to be bubbling up. John might be more aware of it than I am, but it doesn't seem to be bubbling up a lot in our conversations with young people at the moment. And if they're going to operate autonomously in this world that we're going into, how do we build digital literacy in a way that actually gives them that autonomy and confidence to be able to engage?
Erika, I'd say it's never too late, and of course we should have a crack at this. I know in my own social circles and people I know with children, a lot of people are starting to change their habits and their behaviour and are starting to become more aware. And with a little more assistance from folks who are a little more expert in this area, I think awareness raising could go a long way. And there are also a lot of regulatory options that governments can have a think about, and it can be incredibly motivating.
And I've noticed that this has sparked a little bit of a flurry of similar questions on the Slido. How do you think these ideas of the right to be forgotten and controlling your own history as an identity play with this idea that Kashmir raised about multiple overlapping identities, your work identity, your home identity, your sex worker identity, your psychologist identity? How do we manage these dual pressures, one to have these very diverse identities and the other to control them in history or in terms of their social space?
Yeah.
We should be able to have as many identities as they want, as long as they're not fibbing and breaking any laws. Yeah, I guess that just puts a lot more onus on you to look after all of those identities.
Yeah. And people reinventing themselves is not new. And over a lifetime, people reinvent themselves in lots and lots of different ways. And it's just another kind of building on that literacy of how do you reinvent yourself in a world that retains lots and lots of history and that sort of thing. So.
I just think it's so difficult because the internet just flattens everything, and it's so hard to maintain different spheres in the way that we're able to in the real world. In the real world, you can, have your professional life, have the Alcoholics Anonymous meeting that you go to, be a parent, and you can kind of keep all of these things separate. But online, everything runs into one another, and also especially with data breaches. So maybe you have your Ashley Madison account, and then a data breach happens, and all of a sudden it's linked back to your real identity. So I think this is one of the great struggles of the modern age, is that it is much harder to have separate identities, that they tend to merge, and that there's both kind of nefarious parties and also just a whole industry of data brokers that look to put all this information together. And so I think it's a real struggle, and that it's forced us to have a flatter sense of self.
I no longer teach electronic commerce, and the reason I no longer teach electronic commerce is it's not practical to be in business without being online. And I'd say we shouldn't be teaching electronic life. It's life. Life is, for a large proportion of our population, your online identity is inextricably tied in with your physical world identity. So I don't think we can treat them so separately.
And this is where I often challenge people when they say the phrase real identity. Real might be a very subjective term in the real, but I think it's a term that's coming into play because of the pressure that you've identified for us to have a singular identity, because that's easier to market and to process. And this ties in nicely to a question that just popped up, which I hadn't thought about, which is a good one. But China has been recently introduced the idea of a social credit score. Does everybody know about the social credit score? Do I need to recap that? No, cool, yeah. I'm just going to say thoughts.
Scary.
It reminds me of an episode of Black Mirror.
The Slido actually mentioned Black Mirror. Yes.
Yeah, it's. I feel like authorities in China have been reading all of the dystopic science fiction and just taking notes and putting it into operation. I mean, it's a terrifying system and how it's affecting people's lives and their opportunities, the ability to travel. I mean, I think we have versions of the same system that are happening in other countries. It's just not a system that's explicitly operated by the government. And even in China, I think it's still, it's Sesame Credit. It's supposedly kind of coming out of the business sector. But I do think it is kind of a future that we're seeing that is very possible for us in other countries, because I do think this is the goal of these systems in the long term, is to learn as much as you can about a person and make that available to companies that are willing to pay for that information, which is often banks that are offering loans, like who is a good credit risk and who is a bad credit risk, and that is based on all of this information that's been collected about you, from your offline activity to your online activity to your social network. So I think what we see in China is kind of a more extreme version of what is happening everywhere.
Well, I agree, and for us it's a very scary thing, but I think it's illustrating that there isn't a one-size-fits-all for any of these sort of things, and we need to negotiate what our cool versus creepy line is, and actually, once again, have that conversation in a very open way. John?
Yeah, well, I'm not in favour of it. I don't know enough about it, actually. I mean, I know there are different manifestations of the Chinese social credit system, but there's something also that it's a little bit disturbing that, as I think Kashmir was alluding to, so China's building this surveillance state and allocating these credit ratings for different conduct. But we are also buying these things ourselves. We are engaging with these services. We are rating each other. We are liking our Instagram posts. I mean, I had an awkward moment with an Uber driver and noticed that my rating crashed. I'm not going to go into detail. But there is, again, this sense that we're using these services where we rate and are rated, and we don't have control over that. But it does, like in the Black Mirror episode, generate a sense of anxiety if you are always subject to be judged. I mean, maybe that's going to, just to play devil's advocate, maybe that will raise the level of behaviour across the economy, or perhaps, like the Black Mirror episode, we'll just end up screaming profanities into each other's faces for the sheer disinhibited pleasure of it.
So that brings us back to a few different ideas that are playing out on the Slido and in the conversation, but I'm going to start with a very general question, which is, in light of all that we've discussed so far in the keynotes and in this panel discussion, Do you think we're reframing identity from something that is personal and felt, whether it's a diverse identity or a playful identity or a very fixed and rigid identity, to an identity where we see ourselves in this idea of connection with other? So we no longer see ourselves as ourselves, but we see ourselves in the idea of I am myself that has a 4-star rating on Uber and has a great credit score and is really active on Facebook. Are we changing the way we're thinking about identity from the singular to the plural, is my going to be a question. Getting philosophical on you suddenly.
To kick that one off.
I don't think so, but I think everybody has to answer that question individually. I see myself very much as an individual, not defined by those things, but they're important to some people more than others. So for me, I say no.
I just think identity has become kind of more performative because of the way that we are having it reflected online. So I think I just think about it, every time I travel, when I'm with my daughter, how much of my life. This is a huge part of my identity is my work as a journalist, and then my home life is, a wife and a mother, and just how much I want to put that on display for people. And that's just something that we have to think about so much more now than we did before we had all of these digital platforms. So in that sense, I think identity is very much about communities and this just kind of strange evolution into your community is also being your audience. I think that's a very big shift.
Yeah, I think it's great when you can play the system to work so it can work for you. I'm a user of TripAdvisor and I travel quite a bit, and it informs me about good places to eat, and it largely works for me and that sort of thing. But sometimes people don't have that much choice. An example that I've come across recently is homeless in Canada, and a lot of homeless people migrate towards Vancouver come the winter because it has a less harsh winter than other places where it is actually technically possible to survive on the street, where in Calgary at minus 50 it's probably not. But those people, as homeless people, are big users of smartphone technology because they, even though they can't afford a data plan, they can afford to use free Wi-Fi and get there and use public spaces like libraries and galleries and so on to keep warm. And there's a network evolved around finding places to keep warm in Vancouver. Sydney has a similar sort of thing going on, and it's actually social agencies are now starting to actually see that they can build on those sort of things. So there's a community that has actually evolved its own rules around how it wants to work and that sort of thing. So who's to say what's good?
Which segues nicely to a question that's popped up. Who is missing from these conversations about digital identity and trust? Who do you think we haven't heard from yet?
Well, there's one really big missing thing today, younger people than us. For example, on this panel and in these presentations, a lot of us talk about the impact on young folks, but actually they're not here today. So I think that's a missing part of the conversation.
My son will be in the room this afternoon.
I think, we've been talking a lot about identity as something that we control and we put out there. But oftentimes when I think about the surveillance state, I think about the way that it impacts different communities differently. And so in the United States, there are vulnerable communities, people of color, activist communities, low-income communities that tend to be bigger targets of the surveillance. And I don't know that we're represented that those communities are represented on stage. But oftentimes, information is collected about these communities that they don't choose to give. This came up in John's talk, but people of color in the United States are more likely to be arrested. And once you're arrested, you have a mugshot taken and maybe even a genetic sample taken from you. And so people of color are just overly represented in facial recognition databases that are being created in the United States, genetic databases that are being created to solve crimes. And so, once you're in these databases, you get searched against over and over and over again for crimes. So just thinking about to how people's information is collected and how some people's information is collected more than others, and the effects on those communities. So I don't know if that's something that's kind of come up enough on the stage yet.
So I think that segues quite nicely to another question that just popped up. What do you think we might be able to do, whether it's governments or individuals or corporate entities, to protect identities that are perhaps engaging in activism? I'm thinking particularly of our Hong Kong activists who are ripping down facial recognition towers at the moment. Is there anything that can be done to protect identities that, for whatever reason, might not want to be identified?
The onion router. I think it's something that's been bubbling along under the surface for quite a long time, and people find a way to express themselves, and I think it is happening. We saw it with the Arab Spring, and then that got closed down and shifted on, and it's one of those things that's going to be a rolling phenomenon, I think.
I can think of a couple of things. First of all, a little bit of awareness when folks are buying products. So you mentioned before homeless folks with smartphones, or different communities getting into smartphones, and they may not realise that different functions may have an impact later on. So I think someone on the panel mentioned when the police or a law enforcement agency might be asking you to give up what's in your device. In a lot of countries, law can't prevent you to put your password in, but there's nothing, it's a bit silent about whether it can make you eyeball your facial recognition. If folks kind of knew that there was an implication around that when they were designing or purchasing a product, I think that's something that could really help. And I think the second thing that can help sometimes can be standardisation when we're thinking about those who have less digital skills. Take, for example, in the banking sector, two-factor authentication is a really important tool, but with the proprietary systems all the banks using, that can prevent that being used. And when folks have low digital skills, that can be a bit of a barrier.
Again, I think it can be very hard to ask not to be identified, usually because people are trying to identify you for a particular reason. But the way that I often see people trying to do this is by stepping away if you're so privileged to do so. So, deleting your Facebook account, not carrying around a smartphone, using technologies like encryption to send your communications, using something like Tor, and what's hard about that is sometimes the attempt to step away makes you more visible. And so I hear this a lot from people. If somebody's not on Facebook, they're suspicious in some way. What are they trying to hide? The NSA, when it was revealed that they were collecting, basically collecting information from the pipes, if they saw an encrypted email, they were particularly pulling those down to save for later when they could hopefully break encryption, thinking that this must be something valuable, must contain valuable private information. I remember when they first started rolling out Google Street View in Europe, people there were really resistant to it. And so Google rolled out a tool where you could black out your house from Street View. And some people who did this in Germany became targeted by activists who found the blacked out homes, went to them in the real world, threw eggs at them, and left a note in their mailboxes that said, "Google is cool." So I think that what can be hard about trying to step away, you could use, special disguises to hide yourself from the facial recognition camera, but then that makes you more obvious to everybody around. I have seen there's a trend now for facial recognition makeup tips. So there's a new YouTube. I'm aware of the time, so I'm going to ask the panel, and they weren't prepared for this. Rapid fire round. I'm going to ask you one issue or idea that's going to impact questions of identity or trust that we are not talking about yet.
Okay.
Ms. Allan, what's that?
I'd like to see the digital inclusion conversation move from access, skills, motivation, trust, which are all good attributes, sorry John, good attributes of the conversation, but I'd like us to move on to talking about outcomes and what the outcomes are for citizens.
I agree. It's the digital inclusion thing for me all the way. I would love to, as I mentioned before, technologists and the people training the technologists of the future to be really aware of these issues, and really looking forward to seeing what the government's going to do on digital inclusion and upskilling and motivation and trust.
I agree with all that, but also, there's an emerging conversation which has yet to come to a point of decision making about the balance between what governments needs to access encrypted information. This is going to take off. It's going to be the defining issue, I think, of the next couple of years. We've got the Five Eyes countries coming together and saying that encryption is getting in the way of keeping citizens safe and the like. We've seen the San Bernardino issue with Apple. We've seen a whole lot of intrusive, we're having a very oppositional conversation about it at the moment, and I'm interested in seeing how we break through that. Does allowing government access to encrypted data break the systems altogether? Is there some other way? I don't know. Kashmir, what do you think?
I was going to give a completely non-digital answer. I think that consumer genetic testing is going to really change or at least raise many questions about identity in terms of what groups you belong to. I mean, it's very fascinating that Elizabeth Warren, who's running for president in the United States and has been mocked by Trump for saying, he's been calling her Pocahontas for saying that she has Native American heritage. She actually took a consumer genetic test to prove that she was indeed Native American. The idea that we'll be able to use science to say who we are, I think it's very strange, and all the unintended secrets that are coming out through that. People who are finding out that their family isn't exactly what they thought it was. I think that's going to be a huge shift for people on an individual and societal level.
I'm very glad you raised DNA tests because that was actually one of mine, particularly in the Asia-Pacific region, because the DNA sampling pools that they have to identify particularly Pacifica communities is so small as to be statistically irrelevant, and yet still huge claims are being made about these tests. And also there are tests that connect an individual's identity to their entire whānau, their network, strangers they've never met, as you identified. I apologise for all of the questions on the Slido. It was flying really fast and there was amazing questions there that we didn't get to, but please feel free to corner our panellists, and please feel free to continue using Slido, because we've got academics, we've got policymakers, we've got the Privacy Commissioner, we've got journalists on this panel. You can also tell us what you think we should be looking at as well. So what do you want us to research? What areas should receive policy attention? All of these things, you can talk to us over lunch while we're shoving food in our mouths. But firstly, can you join me in thanking our lovely panel, Kashmir, John, Kim and Allan. And finally, can I also just thank all of you for your amazing questions as well? So I hand you back.
Oh, hey, kia ora everyone, and thank you very much for a really insightful, quite wide discussion about cyber trust and digital engagement. On behalf of the team and also the Good Registry, we've got some minutes for you, so I'll let you hand those out to your crew. Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, ma'am. So again, just please give a warm round of applause for our panel. Thank you so much. And Erika, you alluded to a really good point about how we can utilise Slido. So some of you might have noticed that the polls function inside Slido is not necessarily working for you. However, if you want to put forward a poll idea, especially if you're looking at getting some insights from the participants, I'd like to invite you to go to the registration table and put forward some poll options. The team will collate that all for us, and then we'll look at setting some of those polls up in the afternoon. So, whānau, we're just about to break for lunch. Before we do, I've just got a couple of things that I need to mention, so we'll just move across to the next slide. Firstly, now, our dear friend has a Identity Professionals meetup. So can I please just ask you to stand up, because she's going to be a bit of a female Pied Piper to lead you in the direction of a meetup conversation over lunch. Hopefully she's in here. Oh, there you are. Hello, awesome. So, if you would like to follow, there is a lunch opportunity for women professionals to be able to come together, connect, and talk. Now, the kaupapa is that Women in Identity is an international grassroots community of identity professionals focused on networking, career development, visibility, and awareness. They are on Twitter, LinkedIn, and on a website, which is womeninidentity.org. So, if you'd like to catch up, I believe that you're over by Microsoft. There's a big banner where you will all be collecting and meeting up this afternoon.
It's right around the area with the windows. If you can get your lunch and then come over, we can all meet each other and get to know what we're all about.
Awesome. Okay. Now, after this, thank you very much for being patient with us today. You've heard a lot of different and really interesting conversations. In the afternoon, you're going to be broken up into, well, really you're going to follow your nose and decide which workshop you want to go and hang out in today. So from 10 to 2 till 3:20, there'll be 3 work streams. Trust and security in the identity ecosystem. So that will be here in Soundings Theatre. We also have human-centric identity in the Rangi Māori room 1. And we also have a session on artificial intelligence, which is Rangi Māori room 2. Now you can use Slido. So if you saw it, there's an option when you're in Soundings Theatre, but there are also 2 other options as well. So depending on how many people are in the room, you can also pose your questions on Slido as well, and the chairs will be able to pick up that particular conversation and make sure that your questions are heard as well. All right, I believe it's time for lunch. Yeah? Have a wonderful lunch, keep networking, and we shall see you later on this afternoon.